Afternoon, everybody. We'll start now. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those present here today and those joining us online. Today, we are launching a new OHCHR thematic report on arbitrary detention, torture, and ill-treatment in the context of armed conflict in the east of Ukraine from 2014 to 2021, based on the work of our mission. The report will be discussed together with the latest UN Secretary-General report on the human rights situation in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, occupied by the Russian Federation, at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva on the 9th of July. The report aims to promote and eradicate current practices of conflict-related arbitrary detention, torture, and ill-treatment, to prevent future such human rights violations, and to stimulate further efforts to bring perpetrators to justice and provide victims with remedy and reparation. The report is based on more than 1,300 individual cases that we have documented since 2014, and other credible information that we have received. This information allowed us to estimate the overall scope and prevalence of violations that fall within the purview of the report. The majority of conflict-related detentions that we have documented, especially at the initial stages of the conflict in 2014 and 2015, were arbitrary, failing to comply with international human rights and humanitarian law. In government-controlled territory, in the earlier stages of the conflict, this included enforced disappearances, detentions without court warrants, and confinement in unofficial places of detention, often secret and incommunicado. People were held in places such as the SBU premises in Kharkiv, in Kramatorsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and in some other cities, or in other places such as police departments, military bases, and makeshift prisons run by volunteer battalions. In total, we have documented more than 30 such places, but the number could be higher. From late 2016, the use of unofficial places of detention to hold conflict-related detainees for long periods of more than a few days substantially decreased. However, we have continued to document arbitrary detention of conflict-related detainees lasting several days. These men and women were often held in rented apartments, hotel rooms, or similar places, and then transferred to official detention facilities where the detention was then recorded. In armed group-controlled territory, detention during the initial stages of the conflict lacked any semblance of legal process and often amounted to enforced disappearance. Since late 2014, detention in armed group-controlled territory has been more formalized, with the introduction of so-called administrative arrest in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and so-called preventive detention in territory controlled by self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic. In the 532 cases of conflict-related detention that we documented in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, there was an absence of due process guarantees or lack of respect for fair trial guarantees in so-called criminal cases. We found that a large majority of these cases amounted to arbitrary detention. Unfortunately, this situation continues today. In 2014 and early 2015, various armed groups used more than 50 improvised detention facilities, often generically referred to as basements, to hold detainees, but the practice gradually stopped and conflict-related detainees were then held in a number of specifically designated facilities. In some of these facilities, such as the premises of the so-called Ministries of State Security in Donetsk and Lugansk, and the Izolatia detention facility in Donetsk, torture and ill-treatment have been carried out systematically. We estimate that around 4,000 conflict-related detainees were subjected to torture and ill-treatment in both government-controlled territory and armed group-controlled territory, including approximately 3,400 men and 600 women. An estimated 1,500 individuals were tortured or ill-treated by government actors, and an estimated 2,500 by armed groups and other actors in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, mostly by the so-called ministries of state security. Overall, the prevalence of torture and ill-treatment of conflict-related detainees was high at the initial stages of the conflict on both sides of the contact line and has considerably decreased over time. More details on this are set out in the report. Torture and ill-treatment, including conflict-related sexual violence, was used to extract confessions or information or to otherwise force detainees to cooperate, as well as for punitive purposes, to humiliate and intimidate, and sometimes to extort money and property on both sides of the contact line. Methods of torture and ill-treatment used by both sides included beatings, dry and wet asphyxiation, electrocution, sexual violence on men and women, such as rape, forced nudity, and violence to the genitals, positional torture, deprivation of water, food, sleep, and access to toilets, isolation, mock executions, prolonged use of handcuffs, hooding, and threats of death or further torture or sexual violence or harm to family members. In some cases, OHCHR managed to establish identities of the perpetrators and their affiliations, or at least their call signs and visual descriptions. The two annexes to the report cover two emblematic detention facilities in detail. One in the Kharkov SBU premises from 2014 to 2016, which is no longer used, and the other one is the Islatsia facility in armed group-controlled Donetsk that began operating in 2014 and continues to operate to this day. Regarding events at the Kharkov SBU facility, there has been no effective investigation into what happened from 2014 to 2016. The Security Service of Ukraine denies the existence of the facility in which people were held incommunicado and claims that its officers have never tortured or ill-treated detainees there. We look to the State Bureau of Investigation and the Office of the Prosecutor General to fulfill their mandates on this issue. This would both serve justice and also build public trust in the justice system. In relation to Islatsia, we are gravely concerned that the egregious violations that we have documented there and in other places of detention in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics continue on a daily basis. These violations must stop. Unfortunately, there has been little accountability for the violations outlined in the report on both sides of the contact line. While we can count victims in the thousands, perpetrators brought to account only number in the dozens. Remedy and reparation, such as compensation and rehabilitation for victims, are woefully absent. It is often the NGOs that are called upon to help fill these gaps. The report outlines a number of recommendations that, if implemented, would improve the situation, help to bring accountability and stop repetition of further violations. We urge the government of Ukraine, therefore, to ensure that conflict-related arbitrary detention and torture and ill-treatment, including conflict-related sexual violence, are promptly and effectively investigated, regardless of the affiliation of the alleged perpetrator, and that legal safeguards for persons deprived of their liberty are fully implemented without exception. The ongoing reform of the SBU should contribute to the prevention of arbitrary detention, including enforced disappearances and secret and incommunicado detention, and of torture and ill treatment in the future. We urge the self-proclaimed republics to release all those arbitrarily detained without delay and in conditions of safety, to treat all persons deprived of their liberty, civilian or military, humanely and according to international human rights and humanitarian law standards, and to grant unimpeded confidential access to OHCHR and other independent international monitors to all places of detention, including the Izolacija detention facility. 7 years since the outbreak of the conflict, it is unacceptable that such egregious human rights violations remain largely unaddressed and that thousands of victims are still awaiting remedy and reparation. Our office stands ready to provide support to efforts in this regard. Thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer any questions.
Здравствуйте, миссис Богнер. Хотелось бы немножко отойти от темы доклада. Год назад произошло нападение на депутата партии Шария. Никаких продвижений по делу у правоохранительных органов нет. Дело не расследуется. Сейчас Министерство юстиции подало иск о закрытии партии без каких-либо доказательств и назначает ряд экспертиз, чтобы в процессе рассмотрения дела пытаться и найти хоть какое-то обоснование. Иск рассматривается тем временем в суде, который сам президент Украины Владимир Зеленский хочет ликвидировать и называет его коррумпированным и таким, что потерял доверие людей. Неонацистские организации регулярно нападают на журналистов, на экспертов по политическим мотивам. На самого Анатолия пытаются давить через Европу. Суд Печерский блокирует ему счета, сообщают, что Литва лишила его статуса беженца. Нет ли прямое преследование оппозиции? Хотелось бы спросить, как ООН может содействовать тому, чтобы в Украине перестали нарушаться основные права человека?
I mean, I can quickly respond. We're certainly aware of these cases and we have been documenting that. This is a rather different theme to our thematic report, but just to say that we certainly encourage the government to fully investigate any attacks against individuals within their territory.
Yeah. Can I ask?
Can you please summarize how the situation with detention has changed and on both sides of the contact line? And how is the situation now in general? Like, is it better, worse, or?
Okay, thank you for the question. Certainly, as our report outlines, the situation was much more severe in the early periods of the conflict. There were a much higher number of arbitrary detentions and a higher number of cases of torture and ill treatment of conflict-related detainees. I think we estimate approximately 60% of the arbitrary detentions occurred in 2014 and 2015. The exact figures are in the report. So there has been a substantial decrease in the numbers of people who have been arbitrarily detained in relation to the conflict. However, that being said, there continue to be arbitrary detentions on both sides of the contact line and of torture and ill treatment. In terms of armed group controlled territory, we are particularly concerned because the nature of arbitrary detention and torture and ill-treatment appears to be systematic on that side of the contact line. There is no accountability for the violations that have taken place, and as things stand today, there is a huge risk that these violations will continue into the future unless significant steps are taken to change that. In terms of government-controlled territory, we have seen a significant improvement, as is outlined in the report. There are no longer facilities in which people are held long-term incommunicado and arbitrarily. However, we do continue to document detentions where people are held for several days arbitrarily, and it is not declared within the system that they are detained. They're then handed over and put into the official system, and their detention is recorded. So this is still unacceptable and needs to be dealt with. But the situation in government-controlled territory has significantly improved. One of the aims of this report is to see more accountability for the violations that happened in the early stages of the conflict, including in the Kharkiv SBU facility, but also across the country.
Christian, there's also on television. You have said by your own mentions that the decrease is very sharp, but the decrease is obviously very sharp because the nature of the conflict or the war has changed, because 2014-15 you had a very large engagement, and now you have more and more war along the front line. So to this related, my first question, if you are talking about detainees in the uncontrolled territory, is this a repression against people who have another political opinion, who want to stay without this so-called legal system in this territory? Who are the cases now? Because in fact, it's a very small number of people who are detained coming from the other side of the front line. And the second question is related to the question of perpetrators. Are these perpetrators on both sides, or mainly on the Ukrainian controlled side, known, or some of them, and nothing has happened, or how high is the problem that you do not even know who are the perpetrators? And finally, if you may allow, before Corona crisis, we had on a monthly basis 1 million people crossing the contact line. Now this number was decreased up to 80,000 a month. So it is clear that also in this case numbers are decreasing, but have you reported also something happening on the contact line when people wanted to pass and they were detained?
Okay, thank you for the questions. In terms of the significant decrease in arbitrary detention and torture and ill-treatment of conflict-related detainees, you are right in one regard that does relate to the nature of the conflict, that it has decreased. However, on the government-controlled side, we have seen an improvement in the treatment and an improvement in complying with national laws in terms of those who have been detained, even despite the change in the conflict. So we do see an improvement and efforts being made on the government side to improve and to improve the situation, and that this has led to a decrease in the number of violations. For example, the General Prosecutor's Office has set up a specific body to look into these types of cases, and we see a number of efforts to make improvements on the government side. On the other side, I think that indeed the nature of the conflict has changed. There are less active cases ongoing. However, we do see on both sides of the contact line, people do continue to be charged with conflict-related charges such as espionage and so on. So this hasn't completely changed. In terms of perpetrators, we have collected some information regarding perpetrators. Many victims do not know, for example, the full name, title, rank, and so on of those who have committed violations against them. And often that is in the nature of these types of offences that these things are not made explicit to the victims, so that it will be harder at later stages to hold people to account. However, we do think that if proper, full and effective investigations were to happen, there is the possibility to bring people to account.
One more question. I mean, you have an office in Donetsk. How is your access possible to information at all on the other side of the contact line? Because here it's still an open society, a much more open society, but we know all the problems this OECD special monitoring mission is facing in the territory of Lugansk and Donetsk, which was even now worse because of COVID. Can you explain a little bit how you can collect information? How are you collecting information? Which kind of problems you have in collecting information?
Yes, we have offices both in the city of Donetsk and in the city of Lugansk. That being said, we are under a number of restrictions in terms of how we operate there. And one of the major restrictions is that we have no access to places of detention. And that is in contrast to on government-controlled territory where we have full access to places of detention. This does make our job more difficult. However, as an organization, we work across the world in many difficult contexts. We have a methodology for collection of information, and we follow that methodology wherever we work. This will include doing distance monitoring and a range of other tools to ensure that we can gather information and can verify it. In relation to your final question on the corona pandemic and restrictions across the contact line. Certainly we have been documenting that. We have been documenting the problems that these restrictions, the restriction on freedom of movement, then goes on to affect people's other economic and social rights. So their rights to collect their pension, their right to work, their ability to have contact with family members, right to health, and so on is severely restricted through the restrictions at the contact line. And indeed, I think in the earlier months this year, we saw only about 50,000 people crossing in both directions, as compared, as you said, to approximately 1 million crossing per month before the pandemic. So it is a severe restriction in terms of freedom of movement there.
Укрінформ Ірина Кожухар. Фактично, ну, от, виходячи з вашої доповіді...
Минуточку, я...
Виходячи з того, що ми почули з вашої доповіді, фактично стоїть знак рівності між порушеннями, які відбувались чи відбуваються на території України, і порушеннями, які є на території окупованій. У мене питання, скільки з тих досліджень і опитаних людей, які потерпали від цих наслідків, все ж таки відносяться до контрольованої території і в Донецьку. Те, що у вас є представники Донецького і Луганську, зовсім не означає, що там повноцінно ведеться робота. Відповідно, наскільки коректно ставити знак рівності між порушеннями там і там?
Thank you for the question. We do not put an equality sign. We are not saying that both sides are equal in any sense. What we are saying is that there are violations happening on both sides of the contact line. And under international human rights law, this is something that needs to be addressed. So this needs to be addressed in armed group controlled territory. This needs to be addressed in government controlled territory. The report outlines the figures and the estimates that we have, and I outlined those some of those in my statement. You can go through the report to look in more detail at the exact figures. These are estimates. And they are based on our detailed research since 2014. That's not to say that there aren't more cases. I'm sure that there are more cases, but these are based on what the information that we have been able to gather. But fundamentally, any violation of international human rights law, particularly such egregious violations as torture and ill treatment, need to be dealt with wherever they occur.
Associated Press, the question is, before 2016, I heard that you were able to visit some trials on at the armed group controlled territories. How is the situation now? Are you able to check conditions on what detainees are held there? And second question. And after the recent release of detainees, did you get any new information about the conditions or anything new from that side? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We have been able to attend in the earlier years of the conflict some trials or some parts of trials in armed group controlled territory. We have not been able to do so in more recent years. We haven't had access to trials. However, we are still able to collect information from a variety of sources, including victims and witnesses. Some of those are in armed group controlled territory. Some of those have crossed over into government controlled territory. Certainly, when people are released from places of detention and we are then able to interview them, this is another source of information in terms of conditions in places of detention.
Влада Суркан, телеканал «Дом». Ось у вашій доповіді не бачу. Вітаю, Влада Суркан, телеканал «Дом». Ось у вашій доповіді не бачу саме ситуації щодо Криму. Отже, знаємо, що багато зараз затримань, особливо кримських татар. Яку інформацію щодо цього можете дати? Дякую.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, this report does not cover substantively the situation in Crimea. There is a small part in the background section which refers to Crimea. However, on the 9th of July in the Human Rights Council, the report of the Secretary General covering the human rights situation in Crimea will be discussed. That report is already available online, and it looks at the full range of human rights issues in Crimea that we have been able to document in 2020, in the second half of 2020. There will be another report on Crimea, again from the Secretary General, that will be presented to the General Assembly later this year, that covers the full year from mid-2020 to mid-2021. Again, it will cover the full range of human rights issues, including arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment.
I hope you know something which is written in the report of Crimea, about Crimea, because this is related to my question. Is there a structural difference between the human rights situation in Crimea and in the war zone of Donetsk and Lugansk, because, for example, Tatar minority in Crimea is a special issue, maybe not acceptance of annexation. On the other hand, maybe you have on both sides, on both cases, arbitrary detention of people who are against the system which is there. Which are the similarities or differences you have? Maybe you have also religious different issues, because what we were not talking about was, for example, Jehovah victims and the whole range of pressures on religious groups in Lugansk and Donetsk, but also in Crimea.
Certainly, the Secretary General's report on Crimea outlines a variety of human rights violations, including arbitrary detention and torture and ill treatment. And the issues of religious freedom are also raised. We have followed cases and trials in Crimea against Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, where we find a lot of fair trial concerns, as well as other cases where we find that there are fair trial concerns. So there are different types of cases happening there than in the East. For us, Crimea is also covered by a General Assembly resolution, which speaks directly to the issue of occupation by the Russian Federation. So we use that framework in terms of our analysis of the situation in Crimea.
But have you seen also these cases of violation of religious rights in your report in uncontrolled territory?
There certainly are concerns in relation to religious freedoms in the East, in the armed group controlled territory. We are documenting those, and we will be reporting on those further in the future. We have also already reported on that in the past.
Matilda, thank you.
Thank you.